Welcome to episode 39 on the Flowers Podcast, everybody. And I, of course, am Vinny Rose, and we're continuing with part 3 in our mini-series called What the Hell? And to set up what I'm going to cover on today's episode that I've entitled Gehenna, let me remind us what we've covered up to this point so that I can launch today's episode from that context, all right? In part 1, I posed this simple question of, does hell exist? And while that might seem like a strange question to ask, given how strong the concept of hell is embedded in our culture and most of our Christian thought and Christian teaching and practice, and I sincerely asked this question because for many of us, it's just extremely difficult to understand how God, right, who came in the person of Jesus, who was loving and healing and restorative and non-violent, right, and others-oriented and self-sacrificing, could on one hand look like that, look like Jesus, and then on the other hand be totally, utterly violent, punishing, vindictive, and wrathful, right? I mean, that's a really difficult duality for us to swallow. But if you want to be true to what the text where we learn, read, and come to know about the person of Jesus, which is the Bible, if you want to be true to that, we do see many passages in the New Testament where Jesus and his later followers warn about dire consequences for those who are opposed to love and who are disconnected from Jesus, disconnected from the source of life of all things. There's consequences for not being connected to the vine. Therefore, if we want to be, true to that biblical witness and to what Jesus himself is reported as saying, then I believe that you do have to affirm, that there's very real consequences that exist for resisting against love. Or you could also just say that, at least to some extent, some version of hell indeed exists, even though that seems to be inconsistent with the person and character of Jesus on first glance. But please stick with me here, because the giant however here is, if very real consequences for continuing in evil exist, then what exactly does a Jesus-centered looking hell look like? Or what does a Jesus-looking hell look like? What does Jesus-looking judgment look like? What takes place in this Jesus-looking hell? And what's going on in this type of judgment? What purpose does a Jesus-looking hell serve? And so on. So that's why I set up that first episode, both affirming Jesus' own words about there being very real consequences for not being connected to him, but also challenging this traditional view of hell and suggesting that there is a more Jesus-looking concept of it than what we so often imagine. And the reason why I'm advocating for this alternate or alternative view is because what we covered in part 2 of this series, which is when I went over and described in horrific, vivid detail what is this traditional view of hell. And this traditional view of hell, the view we get from comic books and jokes and from the medieval period and from pop culture and many conservative churches, it just simply does not match up with the character and nature of God as was displayed in the person of Jesus. Period. I mean, it doesn't. What am I talking about? Well, Jesus, he was entirely nonviolent, teaching others to be nonviolent, commanding his disciples and his followers to be nonviolent. And in the greatest display of God's nonviolent nature, Jesus went to the cross and died a tortuous death, choosing to endure pain and suffering rather than to retaliate and pay back with violence against those who were doing evil to him and who were fully deserving of violence. That's how God was presented to us through the person of Jesus. Nonviolence is the core of how Jesus presents who God is. And Jesus displayed what the character and methodologies are concerning God's sovereignty and how God, uses his sovereignty and his power. So no, I don't believe God forces or coerces or uses bloodshed or violence to get his way. or to do harm to others to get his way, or murder in retaliation. But he instead gives himself over in love to expose evil for what it is, which causes evil to implode upon itself. That just evil backfires. That's what the cross did. And that's how Jesus portrayed God to us. But yet, the traditional view of hell, it's an exact opposite of that. The traditional view of hell looks nothing like the life and ministry of Jesus. Rather, it views God as being the one who actively punishes people against their will. Punishment that includes a literal burning with fire and flames, and not a punishment that brings about good or restoration or character perfection. It's not like when I was younger, spanking was still in, and your parents would spank you to teach you a lesson so that way, not so you would die or, be tortured, but so to prevent you from making worse mistakes in the future. But when it comes to this burning that we look at in the view of hell, this burning never ceases. It goes on for all eternity, and it comprises of the most agonizing pain imaginable, and that only for the purpose of inflicting pain and suffering itself, with no possible redemption to be had, which amounts not to mere punishment for being guilty, but torture, cruel and unusual torture. So that's what we did in the first episodes, the first two here. And lastly, in my recap, before we go on to this episode on Gehenna, I released a longer bonus episode that was a brief survey on what does the Old Testament teach about the afterlife. And there's a reason for this. What does this constant, fiery, eternal torture that we find in the Dark Ages and in pulp culture today, how does that line up with the biblical narrative that came before Jesus? And what we found is that it doesn't line up at all. Instead, you either find that all people just die physically, and that's the end of the story, or a soulish or spiritual part of them descends into a lower place named Sheol, which is not a place of fiery eternal judgment with pain and torture, but it's a place of finality, a place of rest where, as Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, there's no work, and there's no thought, and there's no knowledge, and there's no wisdom. It's a place where Job said there would be, people would be asleep and at rest. It's not a place of judgment, but a place where you are inanimate and, barely conscious and, really able to do anything, right? If that. So if that's the case, where are we getting this idea of eternal burning with flames in hell? Well, that's where we're going to start today. In today's episode, it all comes down to this word, Gehenna. So let's dive into this, and let me also say that what's going to come next is going to surprise and shock probably most of you listening to this if you've never heard or been taught anything about this word Gehenna before. So buckle your seatbelt, put your tray tables up, because here we go. So here's another question I'm going to throw at you guys. Isn't it true that Jesus taught that there's a hell? Well, the actual truthful answer to that is an emphatic no. Like if you look on it head on. No, but at a side angle, or a tangential angle. Okay, yes, but in a different way than what you think. Because we tend to take this hell and conflate it with this word judgment, and we have oftentimes the same understanding of both, and I think they're different. That's what I'm getting at here. So if that makes you confused, hey, well, don't be, because by the time I finish, I think I'm going to clarify all this stuff. Just take a few minutes to get there. Now, if you don't know anything about Jesus' teachings surrounding hell, the first thing you got to say is, hey, what the hell are you talking about, Vinny? Pun intended there. I know my Bible. And the Gospels in the New Testament records Jesus saying that word hell, H-E-L-L, a bunch of times. He says hell, maybe 7 times in Matthew, 3 times in Mark, once in Luke, and I might be getting a few numbers off there, but something close to that. So really, what are you even talking about, Vinny? You're just off your rocker. Well, if you're thinking that way, let me pull out one passage that's going to illustrate this point here. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verses 37 through 39. And I usually use the ESV translation for these podcasts. This is during Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount discourse. He says, hey, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who merely looks at a woman lustfully or with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus goes on to say, hey man, if your eyes cause you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one of your body parts than your whole body be thrown into hell. That's what it says in the ESV, literally hell there. Well, there you have it, folks. There's that word, hell, right there in the New Testament. Our modern translations have that word hell as if it came straight out of Jesus' mouth. So isn't this proof that Jesus taught about a real hell? No, it's not. And that's because Jesus never used this word hell or its English translation equivalent. And I'm going to prove it to you over the next 20 or 30 minutes here. There's actually something crazy interesting going on here in your Bible with this word hell that you probably never knew about. I certainly didn't. I had to have this, taught to me, and I had to research it because I didn't believe it when people taught it to me. I had to really get down to the bottom of this. So whether you're looking at a physical Bible right now or using a Bible app online or something, many of your Bibles, when you read a passage like that with the word hell in it, it'll have a superscript, a little tiny number above the word by that word hell. And if that superscript isn't in your Bibles that you're reading in this Matthew 5 passage, in verses 37 to 39, it's in other ones because they don't do it on every single time because they just do it once you can take that and put it on the other times hell comes up. And if you look at that superscript or that footnote in the margin or the footer, or you could click on that link, it'll tell you that this English word hell right there actually comes from the Greek word Gehenna. Gehenna. That's what the superscript tells you? I mean, that doesn't do us any good. What the heck does Gehenna mean? All right, so we started with hell. Now we just went one layer below that to arrive at this word Gehenna in our little search here. And it doesn't do us any good to know about that because we don't know what Gehenna means. So now we have to go another layer down. We got to go, to layer 2 here and find out what this Greek word Gehenna means and investigate it. Okay, Gehenna is a Greek word. It comes directly from a Hebrew word. Now this next part's going to get a little bit technical, so bear with me. Gehenna is directly transliterated or carried over from one language to another. The Hebrew word and Greek word, they try to sound exactly the same. So in the Hebrew, it would be pronounced Gehenna, close to that, and then so you write it out in Greek as best you can to make those vowel and consonant sounds. It's like the word shalom. The English equivalent, it's a Hebrew word, but the English equivalent for that Hebrew word shalom means close to peace, like peace to you. But many folks just say shalom to each other, even though it's not. You can just say peace to each other. Shalom, spelled S-H-A-L-O-M. That's how we usually spell it in English. And guess how the original Hebrew word for that was pronounced? Well, it's pronounced shalom, as far as we know. Because that's an ancient language, but that's how we translate it now. You see, Hebrew and English use totally different alphabets and different characters. So when we pull this Hebrew word for shalom, it's got all these, it's read instead of left to right, it's from right to left when you read it, and it's got all these different characters, alphabets. If you try and put it into English, it comes out of your mouth as shalom, or we would write that as S-H-A-L-O-M, because that's how we, enunciate, or that's how we, pronounce a word that sounds like shalom out of your mouth with S-H-A-L-O-M. The original Hebrew word and the English letters S-H-A-L-O-M, they're both pronounced the same, shalom. So they use different characters in the language. That's kind of the idea behind a transliteration. So when we get to this Greek word Gehenna, it's translated into English as hell, H-E-L-L. That's why you see in your New Testament Bible, you see the word hell there with that superscript. So it's actually this Greek word Gehenna, G-E-H-E-N-N-A. But what's different here, when we take Gehenna and put it into English and use that word hell, hell is not a transliteration of Gehenna like it is with shalom, right? Hell is a completely substitute word or a translation of the Hebrew word that Jesus spoke. And this Hebrew word sounded like Gehenna. Okay, now if that's technical, we can listen to that again. I may not have explained it that well. But there's a difference between a transliteration and a translation. That's what I'm getting at. But folks, we're now 3 levels down. We're starting with this English word hell, and then going to the Greek word Gehenna, spelled G-E-H-E-N-N-A. And now we're at the Hebrew word that I can't describe how that's spelled because I don't know the Hebrew language. But it sounds like Gehenna, just with a different alphabet. But we still don't know what this Hebrew word that sounds like Gehenna means. I mean, this is frustrating. You can see how complicated sometimes looking at the Bible is. Now you would think, right, that Gehenna must mean the place where bad people go when they die, where God punishes them forever with burning flames. Right? That must be this Hebrew, that must be what it means, or the meaning of the word that Jesus used in the Hebrew for Gehenna. Because when we hear this word hell, that's what we think of. We think of all the images we've gotten from pop culture and medieval art and from our conservative churches and stained glass windows and things like that. But what I'm about to show you is that when Jesus used this word Gehenna, he did not mean a place where bad people go to suffer eternal conscious torment. Not at all. But to show you this, we have to go down one more level. We got to go to level 4 now just to find out what this Hebrew word that sounds like Gehenna means. And once we find that, we can finally understand what Jesus meant when he said it. And folks, what I'm about to say about Gehenna, this is undisputed. Every single scholar, academic, and theologian agrees with what I'm about to say. Your study Bible or your study guide is going to agree with what I'm about to say. This Hebrew word that sounds like Gehenna, it's a 2-part word. Ge, meaning a valley, and Henna is roughly, for this word, Hinnom. Put that together, you have the Valley of Hinnom. Hinnom was probably the name of a person, so it's his valley, the Valley of Hinnom. Yes, that's what it is. But oh no, it's happened again, guys. Darn it to hell, pun intended. What the heck does the Valley of Hinnom mean? We're at the same thing again, gee whiz. We're 4 layers deep and we still have no idea what hell means because we found out Jesus is talking about some valley named Hinnom. This is crazy. So being that we're stuck at this compound word, the Valley of Hinnom, we got to go down another level. Hit the elevator button. Level 5. Dun, dun, dun. The Valley of Hinnom that Jesus uses here in Matthew 5, it's not a random phrase. It's a literal place, a physical, geographical location in the city of Jerusalem in the country of Israel. I don't know if you knew that, but it's a shocker. You can drive up to it. You can walk in it. You can spit over its edge and see how long it takes for your spit to hit the bottom, which probably won't be that long. I don't think it's that deep. It's a literal valley that exists outside the central part of the city of Jerusalem. That was what Jesus was saying when he said it's better to pluck out your eye rather than have your whole body go to hell, rather than have your whole body go into this valley of Hinnom in Jerusalem. He's saying it's better to get rid of sin, or to rid yourself of sin, than to be put in this valley named Hinnom in Jerusalem. Well, we're getting closer, right, to an understanding, guys, but we're still not there, are we? What was Jesus trying to say to us by warning that it's better to take out your eyeball rather than be in this valley of Hinnom? I mean, what the heck is Jesus talking about? He's saying that we don't want to go to this place. It's like, hey, you don't want to go to the south side of Chicago, or, North Minneapolis, or the bad part of town. Is that what he's saying? I mean, what was so significant about this valley of Hinnom that Jesus would contrast these things with plucking out your eye? Well, it has certainly no meaning to us in the 21st century who don't live in Israel, and don't live, even if we did live in Israel, it may not carry that same understanding in, 2,000 years later. So I guess we have to look backwards towards the people of Jesus' day and find out what it meant for them. And for these first century Jews, the valley of Hinnom indeed meant a great deal. And this is because it had great historical significance for the people of Israel. And no surprise, now we're going to go down one more level to level 6 and find out what Jesus meant when he warned about Gehenna. I hope this is the last level. Oh, real quick, side note, we don't have any reports of people in Israel, around Jesus' time, literally plucking out their eyes or cutting off their body parts so that their whole body didn't go into the valley of Hinnom. I think it's pretty safe to say here that Jesus was talking metaphorically here. That's the context. And trying to use dramatic language and cultural idioms that people would understand to bring the listeners home to the point he's trying to make. It's similar to when Jesus said, you need to hate your father and hate your mother and hate your wife and hate your children and hate your own life to follow him. No, you see, Jesus went around healing people with physical illnesses and restoring blindness, not encouraging people to become blind, to literally save themselves from their sin. If that was the case, then you would hear pastors and preachers telling their congregants to remove body parts, which doesn't happen, even in the most conservative churches. So just as Jesus is speaking metaphorically here about cutting off body parts, he's also speaking metaphorically about this valley of Hinnom. But on to level 6. We don't have time to read all the passages, but you can piece this together from 4 or 5 different places in the book of Chronicles and 2 Kings and the prophet Jeremiah. But the valley of Hinnom was where the practice of sacrificing your children to false gods was done. Yeah, I'm talking child sacrifice, right? The murder of your child to try and make the gods happy, to try and appease them. I mean, and this child sacrifice wasn't merely a slang of the throat, but as the Old Testament says, some of these fallen kings, the kings of Israel, caused their children to be burnt in the fire as a sacrifice. Whoa. I mean, this is the worst abuse imaginable. It's heinous. It's outrageous. It's unconceivable to our 21st century ears that any type of behavior like this would happen. But cultures all around, ancient cultures, did this kind of stuff. That's how bad their idea of God and gods were. So this is why God, of the Bible, Yahweh God, was so adamant and vehement in commanding his people that they shall not follow after other gods. That's one of the main premises of the 10 Commandments. And understandably so when we see this. Israel's prophets, they realized that the sins and atrocities being done in this valley of Hinnom were some of the worst to be ever committed, and therefore, this valley of Hinnom became a metaphorical symbol for the grossest place imaginable that was God-forsaken. And for our study on hell here, it was a metaphorical warning that God's judgment was going to come upon sin, big and small, that you were going to be reckoned with when you came face to face with God for your thoughts and actions. Gehenna doesn't have anything to do with eternal conscious torment. It's not what Jesus was saying when he was warning about going to Gehenna, to the valley of Hinnom, going to hell. It's a reference about God's judgment towards sins. It's not a physical location of the underworld and the afterlife. That's not what the valley of Hinnom was. It wasn't represented by that. It's a metaphorical location of being held accountable for what you think and what you do. All right, moving on. A century later, after the practice of these child sacrifices had ended, the prophet Jeremiah comes on the scene, and he finds himself amidst a people who, well, they may not have been committing the same child sacrifices in the valley of Hinnom, but they were guilty of doing really bad things such as idolatry and social injustices and covenant unfaithfulness to God. And to warn them about what was going to happen to them if they didn't turn from their destructive ways, Jeremiah flips the script on this valley of Hinnom as this place where humans once did atrocious evils, and instead casts this valley, as a place where evil was going to come back and ricochet back on them due to their sins. Here's what it says in Jeremiah 7. It says, "And they have built the high places of Topheth," high places where you did worship and sacrifices to false gods. And he says, "which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I did not command," he's speaking for God, "nor did it come into my mind. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it will be no more called Topheth, or the valley of the son of Hinnom," it's going to get renamed, "but the valley of slaughter. For they're going to bury in Topheth, because there's no room elsewhere." The slaughter, the judgment for their sins, it's going to ricochet back upon them so bad that there's going to be so much death in the land, metaphorical death in the land, that this happens, that they're going to have to take this holy place that you're never supposed to bury somebody in, and they're going to have to use that as a burial ground. Wow. Now, of course, the prophet Jeremiah is using exaggeration and hyperbole here, but as far as we know, there's no grave or mass gravesite in the valley of Hinnom, right, where this prophetic warning ever came true. It's just a warning. Jeremiah was not talking about a literal place of destruction, that this was actually going to happen in this valley. But the geographical place, this Gehenna, because of things like the prophet Jeremiah says, it became known as a symbolic reference place to the dangers of being subject to God's judgment. For Jeremiah and the people of his generation, it was not a physical place of eternal burning that people go when they die, which is what we think of when we think of that word hell. No, the valley of Hinnom is a metaphor for a day or an age or a reality in which God is going to deal with one's sins. And when God deals with one's sins, that's called judgment. Now, I know when we hear this word judgment, including me, it raises a whole bunch of really scary images. Because when we think of God's judgment, we think of the traditional images of hell. Don't we? And I'm going to be addressing this whole idea of God's judgment in later episodes, so just hang on there. But what I'm pointing out right here is that when Jesus warns about going on and continuing in sin, and not trying to compare, well, at least I didn't sleep with her, but, I thought about it. That's what he did in the Matthew chapter 5 passage that I read. He's not warning that we might one day end up in eternal conscious torment with flames, but he's warning that we will find ourselves in a reality where God is going to have to confront us and deal with our hardness of heart. We're going to be subject to what is called God's judgment, which is when God comes face to face with the brokenness of our hearts and deals with it. Therefore, God himself, and who is God? Well, God is love. It's not his characteristic, it's his essence. It's what God is. God is going to be intersecting directly with our brokenness, and all of our brokenness is going to be dealt with in his presence. And this is going to be an incredibly painful experience for us, because we're going to finally see ourselves for who we are. And we'll see the fruits of what we invested our time and efforts in, and how hideous it is, and how unloving it is, and how self-centered it is. And that is going to be the judgment of God. Now again, we're going to be dealing with this concept of God's judgment in later episodes in the series. So if you think I'm going soft on God's judgment, I'm not. However, I do believe God's judgment in ultimately dealing with all things in the cosmos that are opposed to his other-oriented love is going to look quite a bit different than our traditional picture of hell. So put that idea of God's judgment on pause for now. We'll come back to that in future episodes. It took us 6 layers to finally get to a place where we're starting to understand what Jesus meant when he warned us about being tossed into Gehenna, into the valley of Hinnom. But there's actually more details about Gehenna that I have to share with you if we're going to get the full picture of Jesus' words. So I'm going to do that now, and then lastly I'm going to finish up with this idea that if hell just means a valley of Hinnom and a metaphorical reference towards God's dealing with our sins and brokenness in judgment, and since Gehenna is truly not a place of eternal conscious fiery torment, when Jesus was saying that, then why is it that we think of God's final judgment is a place of fiery eternal torment? I mean, if Jesus didn't talk about a literal hell when he was saying this word hell, the 12 times he said it, or it's translated to us in our Gospels, then where are we getting this traditional picture of hell from? You know, and other questions related to this. So that's what we're going to do today as we move into the second half of this episode. All right, moving on with this additional information on Gehenna, here's something very interesting to note. Between the time when Jeremiah used this word Gehenna, which is, I think, the last time it appears chronologically in the Old Testament, up until the time when Jesus uses it in the 1st century as recorded in the Gospels, there's no known places where Gehenna is used to refer to God's judgment. It's not in any other parts of the Old Testament. I mean, that's weird. It's as if Jesus was pulling Gehenna right out of the Old Testament and then using it to get his message across to a population of people who would have, been familiar with that Old Testament reference. Right? So that's one possible explanation for what Jesus meant when he, said this word Gehenna. Like, people would have gone, oh yeah, Jeremiah talked about that. We know what that's all about. So that's plausible, but I think there's more going on here. The first thing I'll say is that, and you might have heard this, which is that during Jesus' lifetime, it's been suggested that the geographical location of the Valley of Hinnom was Jerusalem's city garbage dump. It's theorized that this garbage dump was constantly burning as people burned their garbage. I mean, you want to burn your garbage, right? Because you want to get rid of the rotting smell and all the rodents that would be in there. Therefore, this city garbage dump theory, that's what the Valley of Hinnom, they theorized that's what it might have been. When Jesus spoke about the warnings of Gehenna, he was literally talking about the town's garbage dump, which that'd make for a very accessible warning for the people of his day and age. That might be where we get these fiery images from, admonishing them that, hey, committing sin is going to get you thrown and burned up in the garbage. It's just as bad as anything else. That would be a pretty relatable analogy, now wouldn't it? A book by Rob Bell, I think it came out in 2011, Love Wins, took this position, and boy, it got a lot of criticism from those who hold on to this traditional view of hell. Rob was saying that Jesus' warnings about Gehenna were not to teach about some impending underworld or underground world of eternal conscious torment, but how sin leads to this metaphorical, miserable garbage dump-like place. That sin leads to a destructive decay. That sin is a garbage dump of existence and perpetuates garbage and perpetuates in that you're going to get burned up in it if you practice it. And it brings dire consequences. And certainly, if the Valley of Hinnom was Jerusalem's garbage dump in the first century, then that would bring a lot of bearing in interpreting what Jesus said. Yeah, it would change the whole understanding. And it's totally possible that this was the case. However, there isn't really any historical or biblical or archaeological evidence to support that the Valley of Hinnom was indeed the town's garbage dump during Jesus' day. The first time this garbage dump idea is suggested, as far as we know, wasn't until about 1100 by a Jewish rabbi. And then it got more popular in the last couple centuries by Christian theologians. So who knows? I mean, Rob Bell could be right, but I wouldn't necessarily hang my hat on that or hold my breath being that that's 100% accurate. But a second possibility explaining some additional context to what Jesus was talking about, it goes along with the bonus episode I did on the Old Testament's view of the afterlife. But sit tight, because it's going to take a few minutes to get through this. But I really want to do it to kind of show you I've really looked into this and to really give the full picture of it. So, although we don't have any known writings after the book of Jeremiah where the Valley of Hinnom is mentioned as far as the Old Testament's concerned, there was quite a bit of writing done in what you call the intertestamental period, which is that period after the close of the Old Testament, kind of like around Malachi, between the beginning of the New Testament with Jesus, which comes out to maybe 400 years. There's a gap where the Old Testament ends and the New Testament begins, where there's nothing going on in your average Bible. Now, these writings don't mention the Valley of Hinnom or this Hebrew word Gehenna either. But they do give us some more information about this general topic of God's judgment and what was going on in the minds of the people during this day, of what they thought about it. This intertestamental period is the time I talked about in that bonus episode, where the people of Israel, they went through this renaissance in their views of the afterlife. And in their history prior, back in the Old Testament, and the thousands of years that covers, their afterlife view was, when you're dead, you're pretty much dead, and that's the end of your historical story. However, in this intertestamental period, their views evolved in three major areas. One was that the people of the earth who had died were going to be resurrected back into a physical body. Two, that God was going to be dealing with people's past sins and whatever state they're currently in when they died at this resurrection. And we can call that judgment. And three, that evildoers are finally going to be dealt with during this age of judgment. So these three ideas got really ramped up during and developed during this intertestamental period. And I've got some really cool historical information on that, and cited a bunch of Old Testament passages that started to hint at this. But rather than go over all that again, just check out that bonus episode. But the point I'm trying to make on today's episode is that some of these intertestamental writings, they associated God's judgment toward evildoers with fire. And even fire inside of valleys, because valleys are deep, dark places, So there's an association there with, God's judgment is going to be mysterious, dark, shadowy, and not a great thing to experience. But listen to this passage from the book of Enoch, chapter 54. This was written in that same intertestamental period, a few hundred years before Jesus came on the scene, because we're going to see some of these things here. It says, I looked and I turned to another part of the earth and saw there a deep valley with burning fire. And they brought up the kings and the mighty and began to cast them into this deep valley. So you hear that casting. And there my eyes saw how they made these instruments, iron chains, fetters, right, of immeasurable weight. And I asked the angel of peace who went with me, saying, for whom are these chains being prepared? And he said unto me, these are being prepared for the host of Azazel, that they may take them and cast them into the abyss of complete condemnation. And they shall cover their jaws with rough stones, as the Lord of spirits commanded. And then Michael and Gabriel and Raphael and Phanuel shall take hold of them on the great day and cast them on that day into the burning furnace, that the Lord of spirits may take vengeance on them for their unrighteousness in becoming subjects to Satan and leading astray those who dwell in the earth. Now, this isn't Bible. This is just some of the writings that were done in this intertestamental period. It shows how some people's views of what God's judgment was going to look like during this afterlife judgment period. But wow, that is some vivid, tormenting imagery. And this type of grandiose writing has a name. It's called apocalyptic literature, which is similar to like the book of Daniel in the Bible in the Old Testament, the book of Revelation in the New Testament. This writing story, like I said, it's grandiose. It's where cosmic scenes of violence and justice are played out, often describing the all-encompassing judgment of God taking place and the thoroughness, the completeness when it comes. It's not only limited to the Bible. Apocalyptic writing shows up in other cultures of the world. But what's interesting about Enoch here, it comes from all this Jewish tradition, is that you don't find any vivid descriptions of divine justice like this taking place in the afterlife when you look at the Old Testament. You don't find any type of descriptions that wicked people survive after death and are held to be judged after they die. You don't find that people are tormented in valleys, in pits of fire in the Old Testament. All these ideas are this bombastic, apocalyptic literature, grandiose, and it stems from this intertestamental period where the afterlife, the resurrection, and this post-mortem judgment, they've all evolved. And now this is part of Jewish belief, and partly Jewish belief. And it became more extensive in the Jewish culture. And this, my friends, that's the culture and mindset that Jesus entered to during the first century. This would have been the kind of material that the Pharisees, more than likely, and other religious leaders would have been at least familiar with as one possible idea of what God's judgment looks like. It was never considered scripture, but it was maybe like a good book, a good novel to read, maybe edifying. And this is super important to know because when Jesus used this apocalyptic terminology in his teachings, because he uses a lot of fiery and tormenting and other things like whipping and gnashing of teeth, when he uses imagery, the Jewish leaders he was often speaking to would have known exactly what he was talking about. Therefore, when Jesus talked about God's judgment and likened that to it thrown into a valley, the valley of Hinnom, a valley already known as a symbolic place of God's prophetic soon coming judgment, and possibly a flaming garbage dump where the fire never gone out, Jesus would have been speaking their language. They would have picked up on exactly what he was getting at, which was this. The main point is that all of us are in danger of the consequences and destructiveness of sin because God is going to deal with these in completeness one day. Yes, Jesus used the strongest language available to him. He didn't soften it, he didn't mince words, to affirm that evil and brokenness are going to be met with God's judgment. And that's when God's judgment comes, and when it becomes real, it'll be real. It's going to be intense, and it can't be escaped. Just like you can't escape fire. Fire, it'll be completed. God's judgment is going to be all-consuming. It's going to get the job done to the fullest extent. This is what Jesus meant when he used that term Gehenna in the valley of Hinnom as a metaphor of God's judgment. And it's also good to point out here that while these places in 1st Enoch where resurrected sinners are eternally punished, sometimes are resurrected, I don't know if that's the case, they might be portrayed as being tortured as a disembodied spirit. I haven't looked into that book enough to really say specifically, but there are other passages in that same collection of Enoch writings where sinners are portrayed to just merely be ceasing to exist, like they're blown away like the chaff of the wind. And in other writings of that time, in additional rabbinic traditions around the same time that speak about this intensity of God's judgment, they say that it only lasts for a little while. And then the evildoers are purged of their evil hearts and restored. So you just can't take some of these eternal, conscious, fiery torment passages from 1 Enoch and try to make a case that Jesus was affirming the same thing just across the board. It was just the standard literature of their day, and that's part of it. You'd have to throw out the other passages in Enoch and these other intertestamental writings where there was no eternal conscious torment and no fire. But the one consistent theme that you find throughout all of them, and the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that when God's judgment comes, it will be complete, thorough, and lasting. All right, folks, we just went about as deep as we could on this concept of Gehenna and the Valley of Hinnom, about as far as you can go. And hopefully by going through all this material together, you can see how when Jesus used this concept of God's judgment, he wasn't describing a well-defined, particular location in the center of the earth where all the damned go when they die to receive eternal conscious torment with unending fire called hell, but a common colloquial metaphor for the inescapable judgment of God towards sin. And in just a handful of examples, almost exclusively in the book of Matthew, he uses the cursed Valley of Hinnom, or the Valley of Slaughter, to make this point. In the Matthew 5 passage that we looked at, Jesus' point was that whether you commit adultery physically or merely look at someone lustfully, it's all opposite to the love of God. It's all sin and equally bad. And all sin is going to be dealt with. And it's subject to God's judgment, whether you think it's big or if it's negligible. And when God's judgment comes, it's inescapable. You can't escape it. So do whatever it means necessary to turn away from that. All right. One more thing on the historical side of this word hell. H-E-L-L, we have in English, because Jesus says it a lot here. The earliest manuscripts of the gospel were written in Greek, because that was the language of that part of the world after Alexander the Great sparked the Hellenization of the East. So if you were to have picked up a 1st or 2nd or 3rd or 4th century copy of the book of Matthew and read it the same Matthew passage as we did, if you're in that area, it would have said Gehenna, not hell. And you would have had to known what that geographical 1st century cultural and the Old Testament context of what the Valley of Hinnom, what Gehenna meant, in order to understand what Jesus meant by it. I know it's confusing. That's what makes Bible stuff so confusing sometimes. And back then, you wouldn't be thinking eternal conscious torment in the afterlife either. Not necessarily. That was a possibility. And really that makes total sense. Why does the book of Matthew have so many occurrences of the word Gehenna? It's got more, it outnumbers the other ones, the other Gospels. And it's used throughout Matthew in multiple places, not just in the Sermon on the Mount, where Mark only uses it really in that kind of that Sermon on the Mount discourse, phraseology and passage there. But Matthew just seems to just throw it around all the time. It's because the book of Matthew is believed to be written towards a 1st century Jewish audience who would have understood that cultural reference, which also explains why we see significantly less usage of that word Gehenna in the Gospel of Mark. It's just a few times right in one little grouping of one chapter. And you only find it once in the book of Luke. I think in Luke chapter 12 or somewhere like that. And Luke was written for a more Greek or Gentile audience with no understanding of Gehenna. Well, that makes sense. And that's why we find 0 references to Gehenna in the Gospel of John. You see Gehenna being used both in the book of James and Hebrews as well, which again are books written to a Jewish audience. It's hard to understand James, especially hard to understand anything in Hebrew unless you understand it from a Jewish context. A lot of stuff about the law and sacrifices and a lot of Old Testament references to things. It's more than likely the average Jewish reader who picked up the Gospel of Matthew and read James and Hebrews probably would have understood the references to Gehenna as being a reference to a dimension of or a declaration of God's all-consuming judgment, inescapable, and that it's a literal valley in Jerusalem, and not to an eternal, fiery realm of the dead where departed souls are tortured in the dark lower parts of the earth. But of course, as the church grew and expanded into a primarily non-Jewish movement, that simple understanding of Gehenna was probably lost pretty quickly. And instead, the Gospels now found themselves in the hands of a different culture and a people who had a different set of cultural beliefs, especially about the afterlife, right? The Greek culture already believed in a robust afterlife in the center of the earth called Hades and Tartarus. Hades being the underworld, the shadowy realm of the dead located in the center of the earth where all departed souls go, good or bad, and Tartarus being like the dungeon-like place in this deepest part of Hades where imprisoned and punishment were the fates of the very wicked. Now, it's true that many theologians and leaders from this early church who wrote about Jesus' teaching about the wicked and the righteous being judged at the resurrection, they believed in a one-way ticket to a fiery place of torment. A lot of early church leaders and early church fathers believed that. But no, certainly all of them did not. I mentioned in the bonus episode how there was entire regions, like the School of Alexandria in northern Africa, that did not take the view of hell as eternal conscious punishment. A whole school of theology on this. There are others like Gregory of Nyssa who didn't see the metaphors of fire associated with God's judgment as a literal torture with flames, but it was the literal presence of God that burns away the evil of one's heart, which isn't necessarily painless, right? You just start to see yourself for who you are. You see the evils of it. And remember, back in the early days of the church, Christianity was not centralized and organized in a way that it is now when we see these larger Protestant denominations and like we see in the hierarchy and system of the Catholic Church. Which means that back then there was a lot more autonomy and freedom of thought within the churches within each little geographical region. So for example, in the West, many in the early church did not see Jesus being fully independent from the Father. They saw both Jesus and the Father more like what they call a modal mode, where they're really just one person, but they manifest and show up as different people at different times. I'm kind of talking Trinitarian stuff here. Where in the East, they were much more stronger in believing that the Father and the Son really were completely different persons and realities, yet together they comprised one being. So you had a lot of diversity like that in the early church because there was autonomy and different regions could have different theology and doctrines. Now I'm not trying to teach them the Trinity here, but I'm just using it as an analogy to show you how there was a lot more variation in church theology back then. A little more like the Wild West. And all this was okay because the church, each church region was autonomous and not under one ruler or one pope. Therefore, the fact that you see various regions having different views on what God's judgment is like in the afterlife, it makes a lot of sense. There wasn't dogma on this issue. Rather, there was a great deal of latitude and exchange of ideas and on many issues of the faith where different opinions were contested but not restricted. However, as the church merged with the Roman state in the 4th century, it became more organized, like the state is organized, with leaders and rulers and subjects and pyramid schemes. And they started ruling over churches like the state. The doctrine and dogma, it became centralized out of Rome. And Rome tried to just say, this is how it is, and all your other churches need to submit. Its views were narrowed and more rigidly defined. And Christianity became less and less open to varying views on doctrine. And along with these centralized and narrowed views, the concept of hell, it was subject to the same fate. And at the state and organizational level, the orthodox position on hell eventually became eternal conscious torment. And this was really important in the development of the Roman Empire, because if you could unify all the churches, so they're not just kind of infighting with each other, and get everyone under one centralized leadership, well, that means less schisms, less revolts, and more unity and more order to the empire, which is what every Roman emperor wanted, unity. Therefore, when the early church father Jerome comes on the scene in this latter part of the 4th century, and at the time of this mass church organization emerging with the Roman state, eternal conscious punishment became kind of the centralized view of the afterlife. So when he begins translating the Greek text of the New Testament into Latin for the Latin-speaking world of the West, which his translation became known as the Latin Vulgate, Jerome does something very key in this development of the concept of hell. He takes the word Gehenna, this Greek word, which remember, just literally, Ge, the valley, and Henna as Hinnom. And every time Jesus says the valley of Hinnom, every time he says Gehenna, Jerome substitutes it. Doesn't transliterate, substitutes it for the Latin word infernum. It's not a transliteration. It's not a translation of the word of Valley of Hinnom. It's a pure substitute word. The problem was that the Latin word infernum had its own connotations to the people of that culture that were different than Gehenna. I know we're going super deep on this, but if you can get what I'm saying, it'll really help you understand this and really I think make a good argument, compelling to perhaps convince you on this. Infernum, that's the same where we get the word inferno from, like Dante's book, Inferno. You know, it had all the different levels of the underworld and the different places and levels of burning in hell. When you think of the word inferno today, you think fire, boiling heat, and torture in flames. If it's really hot outside, you say, man, it feels like an inferno out there. That Latin word infernum actually had nothing to do with Gehenna and the Valley of Hinnom and all that that entailed. Instead, it refers to the lower regions of the earth. That's what infernum means. Like the underworld of Hades. The infernum was not a place of eternal conscious punishment in that culture. It's just a place where the dead go. And this is an amazing shift within Bible interpretation. Jerome takes a literal geographical location that's above ground in Jerusalem, just a valley, that Jesus uses metaphorically to describe God's judgment, and assigns a Latin word to it that refers to below ground, a shadowy underworld, the realm of the dead, and where they exist. Wow, what a change. I think it was done in good faith, because who would have known what the Valley of Hinnom is? We would have had an hour-long podcast back then just to explain it. So I don't think he was, doing this randomly or by mistake. It's more than likely that the church's view was trending towards eternal conscious punishment of the wicked at the resurrection, with this fiery torment, and in a place of the lower parts of the earth. That just became it. So it made sense to Jerome to put it this way, at least in his mind. But remember, this wasn't the only view of hell back then. But it did become the traditional view as the church became merged with the state and centralized, and the church was given a lot of power. So the other funny thing about infernum and the concept of the underworld in Roman thinking was it wasn't a place of torment at all. Fire and torment only got added to that word infernum when Christians taught that the infernal was the underworld where God punishes those who are not Christian with a literal flame. So this is the idea that's carried over from Jerome and gets expounded upon in the Dark and Middle Ages. It's a lot, right? But just one more little thing here, because I still haven't gotten, where did we get this English word hell, H-E-L-L, from? But let me explain that. So when people started breaking away from the Catholic Church and bringing the Bible into the native language of the people, rather than getting it out of Latin, it was Latin locked. They had to do something with this Latin word infernum, because no one knew what that meant. A German person doesn't know what that means, neither would a Norwegian or a French person. So there are many partial translations of the Bible into the native European languages, over the centuries. But in the late 14th century, John Wycliffe produced the first full-length English translation. And when he comes to this word infernum, and he didn't have the Greek text, from what I've understood, he was just using the Latin text infernum. Well, what does that mean to him? It's a place of the underworld, so I need to do the same. So he chooses this Old Norse word, which is where all the Germanic languages kind of had their origin. And the word he uses is hell, H-E-L. Aha, we're finally getting to see where this word hell came from. That Norse word hell, H-E-L, meaning like, northern Germany, Scandinavia. Also, just like that word infernal, the original meaning of infernal, or infernum, it's not a place of eternal conscious punishment where God exacts upon the wicked with burning fire. It's merely the place where departed spirits went in the Norse culture. No, H-E-L wasn't a place of torture or punishment. It's just a place that all people go when they die, like a shadowy underworld of neither reward or punishment, like the Old Testament view of Sheol. And since by this time the church had unfortunately solidified the idea that God's ultimate damnation would be carried out on people in a post-mortem state, in like an underworld, Wycliffe went along with that tradition and translated infernal as hell, which is where we get our English word H-E-L-L. Wycliffe was not using the Greek manuscripts, like I said, when he made this English translation. So you can make an argument that he was unaware that infernum was really talking about Gehenna, like he didn't even know about Gehenna, that word, a geographical valley in Hinnom. I don't know. Maybe he did. You can make an argument he didn't. But 150 years later, John Tyndale completed his English translation, and he did use Greek and Hebrew manuscripts for his translation. The famous King James Version is heavily based on Tyndale's Bible. It uses like 80-90% of it. Yet, although Tyndale would have been keenly aware that Gehenna was a physical location on earth with a rich biblical history and not a metaphorical underworld of the dead, the tradition of H-E-L, the Norse word, was already in place. And so he went with hell when he came across Jesus saying the word Gehenna. And the King James has that same translation or substitute word, hell, in its Bible. And pretty much every other Bible translation up to today, with the only exception of a few, do the same. Sure, you might get some footnotes or subscripts in your modern Bible that tells you a little about Gehenna, but I highly doubt that most people read those and go to the level that we are going to go on this topic to truly get the full picture of it. Whew! All right, we've completed our little episode on Gehenna. Now we're going to go all the way back to that first question that we started with at the beginning of the episode, which is, isn't it true that Jesus taught that there's a hell? A hell that looks like like a square little box of the way we think of it? Well, no. It's not true. Jesus never said anything about a hell that we think of or that we imagine of today. Hell is merely a word used and put into Jesus' mouth to represent an idea of what others from like the late 4th century onward thought about God's judgment was going to look like. And a small, not small, but it's what some had an opinion, because others did not have this opinion of fiery, eternal, conscious torment of hell. Jesus never said that when he used this word Gehenna. And that concept of an eternal burning consciousness, it's not representative of what Gehenna even meant in Jesus' day or when he used it. Furthermore, the King James and other Bible translations since then have continued to inaccurately put this word hell in places it never should be, at least in my opinion. Such as a substitute word in the Old Testament, where Sheol is used, sometimes they're putting the word hell, and there's no concept of hell in the Old Testament. Listen to that bonus episode, you'll see what I'm talking about here. And that's trying to make Sheol, in a fiery, tormenting place in the afterlife, a view that was never held by those people of the ancient Israelites. They never had that. But even though there's no hell in the Bible coming from Jesus' own mouth, as we imagine hell today, one truth comes shining forth in Jesus' teaching that cannot be abandoned or denied, and that's the reality that God's judgment is going to come. That evil is going to come face to face with the consequences it has built up for itself. That one day, if you're not connected to God's life in your presence, it's going to be dealt with so that evil is eradicated. This is a common thread all throughout the Old Testament, the intertestamental period, the apocalyptic writings, and what Jesus said and what his followers said in the New Testament. You can't deny that. Now, if you're hearing all this, you might be wondering, all right, Vinny, if Jesus did not promote our vision of hell when he spoke in the Gospels and used this word Gehenna, where are we getting this idea of an eternal, fiery place of torture from? Well, that's a great question. While our view of hell does not come from Jesus' teachings, when he uses the word Gehenna, we get our view from other places where Jesus and the New Testament teach about God's judgment on sin. These passages have this imagery of fire and burning and a lake of fire, and terminology of weeping and gnashing of teeth, and terminology of utter darkness, which is interesting when you think about how that contrasts with fire, and language like eternal and destruction and damnation and so on. All these descriptions and imagery for the idea behind them all, which is judgment, which is when God will be dealing with all evil things opposed to love, and he deals with them head on in full force. It's from passages like that we take literally, and we patchwork them all together like a quilt and construct an image of a shadowy underworld where a literal torturing fire never goes out, and flesh-eating worms that never die as that fire, along with these worms, inflicts tormenting pain on the unrighteous for all eternity. That's how we come up with our concept of hell. So in my attempts to give a more Jesus-looking picture of hell, just as I did by breaking down this word hell, which hopefully now it takes the hell out of it, I'm going to continue breaking down what I believe to be an incorrect view of what God's judgment against evil is going to look like. And through this podcast series, I'm going to try and help us reimagine this whole idea of hell as we know it. Yes, God's judgment on evil will come. It already has come. It's come in part, just as the kingdom has already come in part. And the fact of it coming to full fruition is a reality. The Bible preaches that full through and through. But what the judgment is going to ultimately look like, and what purpose is it going to serve, and its duration, is something I believe looks quite different than our traditional view of hell. So we're going to end there for today. We're going to pick up next time talking about all the language in the Bible that is used to describe God's judgment as fire. Yep, we're going to do a whole episode on fire and burning. You won't want to miss this one, so stay tuned and join me next time for that. That's all we got, guys, so See you next time, and be blessed.